Good morning. Today's April 5th, and I just want to say that you can click on maps of South America and Central America in the announcement part. And so today's topic is Latin America. Now, what is Latin America? Latin America is any country in the Western Hemisphere whose language goes back to Latin, hence things like Spanish, Portuguese, French. So, for example, Cuba is considered a Latin American country and Jamaica is not, because Jamaica is English speaking. That's the first point. The second point is a true confession. I neither read nor speak Spanish. So my knowledge of those countries comes through English language outlets. Third, the countries in Latin America that I have stepped foot on are Cuba, in Central America, every country other than Nicaragua and Panama, and in South America, I've been to Peru and Argentina and a small chunk of Chile. Apart from that, I have not been to many of these countries. What is interesting about Latin America is what a small footprint that continent makes in international affairs. There are about 600 to 700 million people in Latin America. So it's not small. It's got big countries with large populations. For example, Brazil, the largest, which has 200 million people. Mexico has 130 million people. Colombia, 50 million people. Argentina, 45 million people. And then you find smaller countries. For example, Uruguay only has about 4 million people, and Cuba has about 12 million people, give or take 1 million people in each case, depending on the date that that population goes back to. What is also somewhat unusual about, and there are only 12 South American countries. All the rest is Central America, islands, and so forth in the Mediterranean. What is also somewhat unusual is that in Latin American countries, in particular, they're very large urban areas, as distinct from the population being distributed throughout the country. For example, Sao Paulo has 22 million, Mexico City about the same, Rio de Janeiro 15 million, Lima 11 million, Bogota 11 million. And this urbanization has a bearing on who rules the country and the role of the country in the external world. Let me just hasten to add that the little country of Uruguay, which only has about 4 million population, 96% of all the people in Uruguay live in urban areas. So there are kind of unusual aspects to Latin America. And of course, Latin America was always perceived, since the Monroe Doctrine and so forth, as a sort of in the fear of American interests. The problem, of course, is that America's interests have not been consistent, have not always been constructive, and very often not particularly focused upon Latin America. So, for example, if you want to read about what is happening domestically in various Latin American countries, unless something particularly noteworthy happens, the New York Times very rarely covers anything about Latin America, as distinct, interestingly enough, from some European newspapers. For example, the London Economist, the weekly journal, has a section called The Americas, which, by the way, also includes Canada. But in any event, we actually hear very little about it. What we hear about is people from Latin America coming to the United States as immigrants, and that is either considered problematic or dangerous. During Trump administration, we have the problem at the border right now. But other than immigrants and drugs, which are exported legally and illegally from Central and South America, uh, we don't really pay a lot of attention. Um, there's one small change to that, and that's fairly recent, and that is as climate change is exploding as an area of interest and concern for the 21st century, Brazil is of interest primarily because it has the largest tropical rainforest that sucks up carbon dioxide. And if the rainforest is reduced in size, the carbon dioxide and global warming becomes more and more serious. Now, the head of state, Bolsonaro of Brazil right now, who is sort of a Brazilian version of Trump, that is to say, crazy ideas, um, mow down the trees, open farms, doesn't care about the environment, uh, totally incompetence in terms of COVID. Nobody's going to get it. He's not going to get it. Then he gets it. Then they lock some part of the country up. The whole COVID business in Brazil is terribly serious, not least because there's also a Brazilian variant, which is also not going to be very helpful. So then there's some focus on that part of the world, but basically it's sort of disinterest. They're down there. So then the question is anybody else interested in Latin America? And during the Cold War, of course, there was a high interest on the part of the Soviet Union, which placed missiles, and you remember the missile crisis in Cuba. And Cuba, the communist state during the Cold War, featured a lot in American policy and interest. And then subsequently, Venezuela now, which, by the way, used to be a rather affluent middle-class country benefiting from petroleum exports, which has been decimated by the total, again, space cadet head of the Moderna of the Venezuelan government, and has led, in the case of Venezuela right now, to a huge exodus of people escaping Venezuela. The estimate right now by the UN is that 5 million people have left Venezuela, of which about 2 million are refugees in Colombia, and that impacts on the the economy and so forth of Colombia. So there are these sort of blips where we take an interest in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, but primarily sort of for ideological reasons. And then they either dissipate or they stick around. So let me talk a minute about, I don't mean to be rambling around these different places, but rather to sort of show you that at some levels, the US policy has taken no particular interest in most of these countries. And some of them have, had democratic governments, and those fell, and now they have authoritarian governments, and vice versa. We took an interest in Chile when Pinochet was a dictator, was overthrown by Allende, and then presumably our CIA contributed to the death of Allende. Eventually, Chile has been a fairly democratic country. So we have mucked about, and every now and then we get the idea that something needs to be stopped, and we invade, or we overthrow governments, or we take an interest. And then we sort of hands off. We have no particular interest. If we look at commerce, for example, we have some large amount of commerce with some countries. In the 1950s, when I was in college, I was a research assistant to a sociologist who was a specialist in Honduras and studied and wrote about the United Fruit Company and took a keen interest in the control of the United Fruit Company in Honduras. Some coffee and cocoa companies that we are linked with have controlling interests in Central America. If you go to the Safeway in certain times of the year, you will see that lots of fruits and vegetables come from Chile. But we don't really sort of acknowledge it in our daily lives the way we acknowledge our links to an interest in other parts of the country. And when we take an interest, for example, in Cuba, very sort of strange, is it correct to say strange, but very sort of odd things happen. All right, so we're anti-Castro, anti-Cuba, anti the Soviet link. Comes the end of the comes the end of the Cold War, and of course Castro and then eventually Castro's brother continues a version of communism, although in recent years there's a lot of private enterprise and so on. And we hold it against Cuba, even though nowadays, or in the last 10 years, or even as we speak, we can't have normal relationships with Cuba. Cuba is an authoritarian communist country. Russia has left Cuba a long time ago, right? And if you think about it, we have relations of all kinds with countries in Eastern Europe and so forth who have dictatorships. We have relationships with other countries which are left-leaning and communist in some version. But Cuba is a country we can't have normal relationships with, which seems to any analyst who is not, anti-Cuban, seems like a very odd kind of thing. Well, the answer, of course, are multiple. That is to say, Cuba is a football in American politics. And how and why is it a football? It's a football amongst all Americans who are right-leaning to some extent. Anti-communism is still, a watchword. But it's also the consequence of having many Cuban refugees, for example, in Florida. Cuban refugees who escaped during the Russian-linked Castro communist phase of Cuba are, of course, very anti the authoritarian government. We had a similar thing in the United States in the 1950s, that when there were refugees from East Europe, they too were very unreasonable, might I say, about communism or gradations of communism, and were supporters of Senator McCarthy and finding communists, under every bed in the United States. So they were also hyper anti-communist, as many Cuban refugees in the US are hyper anti-Cuba, right? And increasingly, our refugees from Venezuela in the United States will be hyper the current Venezuelan government. Now, I'm not claiming that the Cuban government or the Venezuelan government is a democratic or a good government. All I'm saying is there's an oddity that we deal with similar governments in the rest of the world in reasonable fashion. We have reasonable relations with them. We have trade and so forth. But on the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, that is presumably a no-no. And so we then have periodic outbursts of policies against those countries. And as we did in Trump, who stopped the capacity of those of us who wanted to travel to Cuba to travel easily, which happened under the Obama. He loosened up on Cuba. And then when Trump came in, he tightened up on Cuba again. And now we'll see what happens under the Biden administration. So our relationships with odd countries here and there in Latin America are seen by most of Latin America as colonial and neo-colonial, are seen by Latin American countries that trade a lot with us as being, helpful relationships, although not necessarily joint actions in politics in particular. And up until fairly recently, with the exception of Cuba and again in Venezuela and some small blips in some other countries in the world have not been intimately involved in Latin America and have let left it to us, in a sense, to do whatever we do or not do in that part of the world. I'm exaggerating because there have been times when when different countries in Europe, for example, have taken more of an interest in this or that Latin American, Central American country. Europe has had normalized relationships with Cuba, and tons of tourists go there and so forth. So that in some countries in Europe, they have a deviant relationship from the United States, but haven't, on the whole, been deeply involved in the U.S. Among other reasons, of course, because the threat has always been on the part of the United States that Latin America is our area of interest, stay out of it. This, by the way, has changed in the last year because while we have taken no particular interest in helping Latin America deal with COVID, both the Chinese and the Russians have taken a keen interest. And most of the vaccinations that are going on in Latin America are either from the Russian or the Chinese vaccines. And in the case of Cuba, Cuba appears to be very close to developing its own vaccines. So let me flip the coin around and say, have some Latin American countries played a role in the rest of the world? And there the issue is also somewhat mixed. Cuba has played a fairly major international role with a footprint which is completely at odds with a small island of 6 million people or so. I'm sorry, 12 million people or so in the case of Cuba, because one of Cuba's exports during the Castro period and now has been medical export. Cuba has trained hundreds and hundreds and thousands of doctors, which it has sent to various parts of the world for decades now. So, for example, in the countries that are Mozambique and Angola in Africa, which were late decolonizing countries, Cuban doctors were all over the place, as they were in some other parts of the country. Cuba has sent doctors to, for example, Brazil, which has a very bad medical system. However, once the COVID arose and Bolsonaro denied that that was a problem or to do anything about it, the 100 or so Cuban doctors went back home. So one of Cuba's big exports to the world has been doctors and medical know-how. And for those of you who've been to Cuba, they have, a rather amazing medical system for its own population and rather amazing training system. Brazil, to jump around, for years had trade, technical assistance, and other things with the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, again, mainly Mozambique and Angola. So there have been countries that have had, in Latin America, which have had a footprint in their foreign policy in the rest of the world, right? Often of greater import to some of these poorer countries than the American footprint. Let me just say it at that. Now, what I've just said, you can say, well, is completely untrue. Don't most of our drugs come from, Central America, from Latin America? Doesn't Colombia grow the big cocoa farms there? Isn't all of that winding up in the streets of Chicago? And the answer, of course, is yes. And a lot of these activities are illegal. And some of them are legal in the sense that they go to third parties and then come to the United States. But the U.S. not drug industry, but the use of drugs, harmful drugs, heroin, cocaine, and so forth, comes from Latin America. And at various times, we've tried to stop it with agents and this and that and the other thing. And of course, we have been preaching to Latin American countries who produce this stuff, that they should stop producing stuff and do, grow other things, have other kind of farming. Periodically, over the last 30 years, we have tried to do a little technical assistance to help them convert from cocoa farms to other products. But it's been periodic, and it has been, by and large, unsuccessful. And of course, the way Central American and Latin Americans, who themselves oppose being so heavily dependent on the drug trade, have been saying is that we in the United States should do something about our consumption of these drugs and don't keep blaming the producers, legal and illegal producers. Now, the drug traffic, if I might skip to something else, has also led to a concentration in many countries, especially in Central America, some extent in Mexico, some extent in places like Colombia and Paraguay, to having an elite in those countries, which is very rich, mostly people of European origin rather than indigenous origin of one kind or another. And these people control the politics and control the society. And so the sort of structure of many Latin American societies, by being very elite structured, and the elite being often very corrupt and corrupted by the drug trade and other unfair trading practices, has led to many of the countries being not only less than democratic, but less than distributive in raising the level of people's socio and economic well-being. But of course, there are huge differences. That is to say, the education system in Cuba is first rate. The education system in Chile, though often criticized, is fairly strong. The education system in Argentina, which is very European, pizza place on every street corner in Buenos Aires and so on, is also strong, but there are some strong universities in Brazil and so on. But by and large, the education of the poorer segments of most Latin American countries has been appallingly bad. And that, of course, leads to individuals doing things like growing the products that wind up in drugs, and also joining guerrilla groups, for example, in Colombia, which defeated the FARC, the serious guerrilla group there, but there are now other guerrilla groups in Colombia. So the elite and the undemocratic and non-distributive nature of the economies of not all, but many of the Latin American countries have led to people doing illegal things, as say joining illegal political movements, but also engaging in legal drug trafficking. So what I'm describing, I'm jumping around a bit, is really a monumental mess in which the U.S. only takes, periodic interests. And while I mentioned the current involvement of Russia, which wasn't much involved in South America up until COVID now, stayed away not to have trouble with the US, and China, there is actually more of an impact from the external world in Latin America now than the US ever imagined or ever thought it should tolerate. And while there is a vacuum of US constructive involvement in Latin America, over the last decade, China has gotten very busy in Latin America. It has made loans to countries. It has done not exactly road and belt in intensity or amount of money that it has done in doing in Asia. But it has made substantial loans, infrastructure projects, Chinese helping, run things here and there. So China is all of a sudden a kind of a new presence, not just because of COVID, but because of other things, like investments, like loans. And as many Latin American countries are doing very badly economically because of COVID, they are having, huge reduction in growth because of COVID in almost all Latin American countries, for that matter, Cuba and some of the Caribbean countries as well. China is busy, in a sense, saying, we're here to help you. And interestingly enough, the one institution which over time has bailed out various Latin American governments, which is the International Monetary Fund, has done relatively little this time around in Latin America compared to the Chinese. Now, this has, many sort of aspects to it, one of which is that some countries in Latin America, like Argentina, have had a bad relationship with the IMF. But that's a separate story. The story really is that Latin America is in a monumental mess with COVID, that China in particular and Russia to some extent, and probably Cuba as soon as it has its own vaccine production, are trying to help out, that Latin American relationships are uneven and uncertain and sporadic. And to the surprise of much of the world, especially Europe, for example, especially Canada and other countries, the US has claimed Latin America as its sphere of interest, but has had a very negative impact periodically in Latin America. And now, what used to be thought of as a sad tale of Latin America, overseas in Europe, for example, is seen as dangerous because of climate change and Brazil. So I think that in the decade to come, Latin America will feature more prominently, both in US foreign policy and in the concern of the world about Latin America. Whether this will all be constructive or not, we'll just have to wait and see. There are aspects of Latin America I'll get back to in talks on other subject matters, but just by this talk is meant to be a kind of overview of that part of the world. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.